So we're going to talk about today critical race theory. So I'm going to set this up and I'm going to turn it to Carly to kind of break this down for us. But here's what seems to be happening. Critical race theory is all over the news. Both MSNBC, Fox, the left media, the right media, they're all covering it. And the narratives that are coming out are not fun or easy to digest. Essentially, and this is going to be the layman's version, we're going to dive in, but the right seems to be saying that critical race theory is anti-American and destroying America. And the left is saying that critical race theory is essential and that those who don't understand it or don't want to talk about it are unable to see the systemic racism in this country. And it's a very divisive topic.
I'd actually push back on that. I think that the narrative on the left is that critical race theory is not actually what we're talking about here, and that the right is wrong to be calling things critical race theory.
Either way, I feel like if you're the right, you hate it. And if you're left, you're not allowed to criticize it, because if you do, you feel like you're a racist or doing something against what Democrats are supposed to be fighting for, let's say. And I think, as usual, the truth is somewhere in the middle. And one of the things, and I'll say this kind of the first episode, but as we do this, I don't want you to come to us all the time for just like our opinions. What I want to do is kind of a breakdown of the news and what you guys are adults, make your own decisions and based on the facts coming out of these narratives or that are being ignored by these narratives. So Carly, can you help us understand, maybe start us with like the high level definition of critical race theory and then where these narratives are kind of going left, right, and sideways?
Sure. I actually think, and I'll kind of loosely define it, but I think that the narrative that I see missing right now in this conversation, honestly, or the points that I see not being made, is actually that the definition of critical race theory is sort of besides the point. And I'll dive into that. So broadly speaking, critical race theory is a legal framework for looking at how our current systems interact with race. You could say like a legal framework for looking at systemic racism. Right. And it's been taught, right? It's academic. It's been taught in law schools for decades. And it's high level academics, as in for older people. And that is important. That becomes kind of very central in the democratic narrative that exists right now. So let's start where everyone seems to agree, which is that all this talk about critical race theory in the mainstream seems to stem back to this one guy, Chris Rufo, who's a conservative journalist, documentarian, who last year became familiar with these anti-racism trainings that were happening within different federal agencies that were saying things like, meritocracy itself is white supremacist and values like individualism is white supremacist, and then a whole bunch of other things, right, around systemic racism and privilege, et cetera. And Chris Rufo, the narrative seems to go, according to both sides, is outraged by what he's seeing here. He goes on Fox News quite famously and is on Tucker Carlson's show and demands that President Trump ban critical race theory as part of trainings for federal employees. So Trump does that. Biden comes into office and reverses Trump's ban on critical race theory. And that's when the fight really moves to the schools. And that's when Chris Rufo starts working with Republicans around the country to write legislation banning critical race theory in schools, in curriculums around the country. And here's what's interesting. So the reaction that Democrats seem to have had to this whole thing has been to take this line of, it's stupid to call this even critical race theory. This isn't critical race theory. Critical race theory is this high, level academic thing that is taught in law schools. Obviously, we're not teaching that to elementary school students. And that's true, but also to me feels like it's very much missing the point, because it's not the point here is about the curriculum and what we're teaching. And so being like, nah, you've made this intentional effort to make everything bad critical race theory, it feels besides the point to me, but that seems to be what's being hammered.
Critical race theory was essentially written by two individuals in the 90s, a couple decades ago.
Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw.
In that document, if you're a Republican reading it, I don't think you would disagree as strongly as they are right now if you actually read what they wrote. Because they also talk about systemic racism and things. They also talk about material interest and structural poverty and things that a lot of us can agree upon, like, hey, a lot of our schools are not funded very well, like, period. Yeah, right? Like, there's things that they are talking about that is bigger than just
basically they're saying, hey, we should be concerned with the material well-being of minorities and the way in which our legal systems keep minorities from material well-being rather than linguistic debates, right? Like, the point, I think, summarized is, like, if we get every white person to stop ever saying or singing the N-word or whatever, you're still going to have the wealth gap. And so, like, what really have we accomplished? And I think there's, that goes to, I think, something that speaks that you and I agree with in terms of, not that we think people should be saying the N-word, but that, like, a universal basic income is such a more powerful tool than so many of the other debates we end up having in the quote unquote discourse. Because it actually
they even talk about, my point was that
people.
in CRT, they actually get to talking about solutions and policies as opposed to just rhetoric. And so it's the whole thing to me is ironic. Where, like, we're debating over how terrible CRT is, but no one's ever actually read what they are. And therefore, we're not actually debating critical race theory. We're debating at its core what's getting taught to children and then what we're allowed to talk about.
And we should say this: critical race theory is a body of scholarship. So there's not one thing. This is why you actually can't define it, because, Zach, you're right that in some of the early days and the early iterations of critical race theory, that's what was being discussed. But you've had other scholars weigh in and other scholars focus on other things and also
that's true. It's a body
do
of work.
that under the umbrella of critical race theory. So this is why you really can't get to a definition of what this is, because it's a body of scholarship with people saying a whole bunch of different things about what it is.
So my hopes of making this simple for everybody
have been dashed. And I think that's okay, because I think it doesn't effing matter.
Yes, it doesn't matter. Okay, keep going.
So you have a big blow up that happens in Loudoun County in Pennsylvania. And this is what you're hearing a lot about. And if you're seeing clips of parents, like, screaming and being like, on either side of this, but being like, how dare you teach my kid that because they're Black, they're always oppressed, and because they're white, they're inherently racist. That's probably from this Loudoun County school board meeting or series of meetings that have happened because of some proposed changes to the Loudoun County curriculum. So the Daily covers this as part of their coverage in general. The Daily podcast covers this as part of their general coverage on, like, what is critical race theory. And what I found so striking was they the whole episode kept it sort of very high level, and they didn't at any point get into the specifics of what the proposed curriculum is in Loudoun County, which feels to me like what we actually should be talking about, not like what is the definition of critical race theory. So I want to the conclusion that is formed in this Daily episode is that basically the fight over critical race theory is a fight between two camps. The first camp, call it in favor of critical race theory, though those are the same people who are being like, this isn't actually critical race theory. Republicans are creating a straw man, boogeyman to attack, and it's not even what this is. Like, they're so stupid, right? That same camp are the people who are willing to admit that systemic racism exists and that it's something we need to tackle and something we need to teach our kids, and that for too long our education system has treated racism like it's something in the past and we need to fix that, et cetera, et cetera. So the Daily is saying that's the people who are in one camp of this, and the people on the other camp of this are, and the way they do it, it feels very much like, are the people who are unwilling to acknowledge systemic racism and are unwilling to grapple with the idea that America isn't the perfect bastion of meritocracy that they once thought, and that they themselves may be a part of a problem. They really paint it like people who are kind of unwilling to face, and the feeling you get is like the reality about America. And I can give you the exact quote.
Yeah, can you give the quote?
Is Michael Barbara, who's the host of The Daily, says, so at its core, this is about, and that this is the fight over critical race theory. So at its core, this is about whether a large group of Americans, mostly white, but not all white, can or should accept the idea that racism is not merely historical, not simply a relic, but something very present and systemic, and something they need to take responsibility for. And then the guest responds, yes, that's right. So they've summarized this as being, this is a fight about whether or not people will take responsibility for systemic racism.
What is frustrating to me when you hear that is that I'm of the camp where, and I think I would argue that the majority of Americans are in this camp, where like systemic racism exists. We have structural problems in this country that are advantaging certain races, advantaging white races over black races. Like you go down the list. At the same time, you can still think that teaching a child that competition and meritocracy is inherently racist is a bad thing. I think those are things that made America fantastic. And
yeah, I agree.
The
I think
Daily's arguing that we can't talk about it without, like, if I take the other side of that I'm racist and I'm acknowledging there's no systemic racism. And I don't
this is the needle that needs to be thread, right? And this is the part of the conversation that I feel like isn't being said. You have, and this is what I'll end up repeating this over and over again. I feel like as we have these conversations, because I think it's what you see very consistently, which is you have Democrats focusing on a macro narrative. You have them saying systemic racism exists. We should be teaching this. And then you have Republicans focusing on a micro narrative, which is, okay, well, third graders in Cupertino were asked to rank themselves and their classmates according to their privilege, which it just means according to like race features, which is bizarre and reductive and doesn't take into account all sorts of other dynamics and like all these other things that can make somebody privileged or not. And is also just a really weird way to start training third graders to think, in my opinion. And as somebody who very much believes in systemic racism. So you have Republicans focusing on these like micro examples of things in curriculum that feel to a lot of us as being quite off. And so you have these two groups talking past each other because we're not arguing about the same things. And it's so frustrating to me that the New York Times in this Daily episode, and I take the New York Times because again, they're held up as still like the gold standard of journalism in a lot of camps. So, you're getting that narrative or worse in the other, mainstream media channels, right? Like the New York Times was taking the stupidest of the rights arguments and debunking those in this podcast, instead of taking, frankly, the most legitimate of the rights arguments and debunking those. And this is what you see over and over and over again, which is so freaking frustrating. So I would say like the needle to thread here is to me, there's a lot. Yes, systemic racism exists, clearly. There are all sorts of systems and I could talk to you about them. Whatever. We don't have to get into that. If somebody doubts this, feel free to DM me and I can debate it with you. Right. There are legal systems that have existed and frankly continue to exist that very much clearly disadvantage like Black people, other races, other than white people. At the same time, to treat it like you are racist or like you don't believe in systemic racism because you do have problems with some of the specific things being taught in these anti-racism trainings. And have a problem with everything being reduced to power according to race, which is absolutely happening, is ridiculous.